Imagine walking into Washington with $550 billion on the table. Not a campaign promise. Not a headline number pulled from thin air. A real framework for investment, loans, and guarantees aimed at strategic American industries. Now imagine another country walking into the same trade war without a comparable fund, without a $500 billion financial package, and without offering to buy its way out. Which country should have more leverage? The obvious answer is Japan. And that is exactly why this story is so interesting. Japan committed up to $550 billion to support investment in the United States and secured a 15% tariff framework, including a lower rate on Japanese automobiles. That was a meaningful achievement. Japanese automakers had been staring at a much harsher tariff environment, and 15% was far better than 25%. But one of Japan's most painful problems did not disappear. Steel and aluminum remained under a separate 50% tariff regime. Now look north. Canada did not announce anything remotely comparable to Japan's $550 billion package, yet Washington and Ottawa are now negotiating a deal that could cut the top tariff on Canadian-built vehicles from 25% to 15%, and could cut steel and aluminum tariffs from 50% to 25%. That deal is not finished. As of August 21st, 2026, Canadian officials are saying the two sides are very close, but important details remain unresolved. The exact treatment of North American content, automobile parts, steel quotas, dairy access, and provincial restrictions on American alcohol is still being worked through. So this is not a victory speech for Canada. It is something more useful. It is a question. Why does a country that did not put $550 billion on the table appear to have enough leverage to make Washington seriously consider concessions in sectors where Japan's enormous investment package could not make every tariff disappear? The answer is not that money suddenly stopped mattering. Money matters enormously. The answer is that there is more than one kind of power in a trade negotiation. Japan brought capital. Canada brought dependency. And those are very different things. To understand the difference, start with what Japan actually did. When Washington raised tariffs and threatened major Japanese exports, Tokyo faced a problem that could not be dismissed as political theater. The automobile industry sits at the heart of Japan's industrial economy. Toyota, Honda, Nissan, Mazda, Subaru, and their supplier networks support a huge ecosystem of factories, engineering jobs, logistics companies, and component makers. The American market matters enormously to them. A 25% tariff on imported vehicles changes the economics quickly. A car that was competitive at one price can become much harder to sell once thousands of dollars are added at the border. Manufacturer can absorb part of the cost. Dealers can absorb part. Consumers can pay more. Production can shift. But somebody pays. Tokyo knew Washington had found a pressure point. So Japan responded with a powerful instrument of its own: capital. Under the US-Japan framework, Japanese government-backed institutions can support hundreds of billions of dollars in American projects through investment, loans, and guarantees. The targeted sectors include semiconductors, energy, critical minerals, pharmaceuticals, shipbuilding, and other industries Washington considers strategically important. That is not charity. Japan has its own reasons to deepen industrial links with the United States. It wants secure supply chains. It wants access to strategic projects. It wants to protect its alliance. And above all, it wants predictable access to the world's largest consumer economy. The $550 billion figure therefore represents bargaining power, but it also represents vulnerability. Japan was willing to mobilize something extraordinary because losing access to the American market on favorable terms would hurt. And the strategy worked in one major area. Japanese automobiles received a 15% tariff rate instead of 25%. That matters. It protects competitiveness. It protects margins. It gives Japanese manufacturers more room to plan. But it did not erase every American trade barrier. Steel and aluminum remained a glaring example. That is where the comparison with Canada becomes uncomfortable, because Canada came into the confrontation with a much smaller economy, far less financial firepower, and an even greater dependence on the United States as an export market. On paper, that sounds like weakness. And in many ways, It is. Canada cannot simply walk away from the United States. The geography is too powerful. The supply chains are too integrated. The customer base is too large. For Canadian auto plants, steel mills, aluminum smelters, lumber producers, and food exporters, the American market is not one option among many. In many cases, it is the market around which the business was built. That gives Washington enormous leverage over Ottawa. But the dependency does not run in only one direction. And that is the part that changes the negotiation. Take oil. The United States produces more crude oil than any other country in the world. If you stop the story there, importing millions of barrels from Canada every day sounds almost irrational. But crude oil is not one uniform product. A barrel from the Permian Basin is not identical to a barrel from Alberta. Much of the oil coming out of American shale formations is relatively light. Much of the crude produced from Canada's oil sands is heavier. That difference matters because refineries are not giant universal machines that can process anything with equal efficiency. Some of the largest refineries in the American Midwest spent decades and billions of dollars building equipment specifically suited to heavier crude. They installed cokers, desulfurization units, and other complex systems because that crude could be bought, transported, and refined profitably. And Canada became the natural supplier. In 2025, the United States imported an average of about 3.9 million barrels of Canadian crude oil every day. Canada remained by far the largest foreign source of crude for American refiners. That is not a symbolic relationship. It is infrastructure. Pipelines cross the border. Storage systems are connected. Refineries are configured around certain grades. Commercial contracts are built on years of predictable flows. Could the United States replace Canadian barrels? Of course. The United States is not trapped. It has enormous domestic production. It can import from other countries. Refineries can change crude slates. Companies adapt. But the real question in negotiation is not whether something can eventually be replaced. The real question is how quickly, how easily, and at what cost. If replacing a supplier requires new transportation routes, new contracts, different crude blends, different refinery economics, and potentially higher costs, then the supplier has leverage even if nobody ever threatens to turn off a valve. That is Canada's first important card. Then there is uranium. Nuclear power rarely enters ordinary trade debates because most people do not see the fuel chain behind the electricity coming out of the wall. But America's civilian nuclear fleet requires a steady supply of uranium. In 2025, Canada-origin uranium accounted for more than 15 million pounds of uranium purchases by owners and operators of U.S. civilian nuclear reactors. For uranium feed delivered for enrichment, Canadian-origin material also represented a very large share. Again, America has alternatives. Australia has uranium. Kazakhstan has uranium. Other countries participate in the global fuel cycle. But nuclear fuel is not a product utilities buy casually when they notice shelves are empty. Contracts are long-term. Enrichment capacity matters. Political reliability matters. Fuel planning happens years in advance. Canada is attractive not simply because it has uranium, but because it is geographically close, politically stable, allied with the United States, and already embedded in Western nuclear supply chains. That is a second kind of leverage. Now move from reactors to farmland. Potash may be the least glamorous strategic commodity in this entire story. It does not make good television. There are no sleek assembly lines, no glowing nuclear plants, no dramatic oil rigs. It is fertilizer. But remove enough of it from the system and farmers notice immediately. Potassium is one of the essential nutrients crops need. Corn needs it, soybeans need it, wheat needs it. The United States is heavily dependent on imported potash, and Canada dominates that supply. Over the 2021 to 2024 period, roughly 79% of American potash imports came from Canada. The United States Geological Survey estimates America's net import reliance for potash at more than 90%. Those numbers matter because a tariff placed on Canadian potash does not stay neatly on the Canadian side of the border. It travels into the economics of an American farm. A farmer in Iowa does not care whether the extra cost began as a trade policy in Washington or a pricing decision in Saskatchewan. If fertilizer becomes more expensive, the farm's input cost rises. Maybe part of that cost is absorbed. Maybe part appears in crop prices later. Maybe planting decisions change. But the pressure moves through the system. That is a third card. Then there is aluminum. Canada is not merely another country that happens to sell aluminum to America. The two markets grew together. Canadian smelters, particularly in Quebec, use large amounts of hydroelectric power to produce primary aluminum. American manufacturers then use that aluminum in vehicles, packaging, construction, machinery, aerospace, and other industries. When a tariff hits primary aluminum at the border, the theory sounds simple. Make foreign metal more expensive and American producers become more competitive. But supply chains do not always obey the clean theory. If American factories cannot instantly replace the imported metal at the same volume and price, the domestic price can rise too. Then the tariff designed to protect one American industry becomes an added cost for another. The beer can manufacturer pays more. The auto supplier pays more. The construction company pays more. The aircraft manufacturer pays more. This is why trade wars between deeply integrated economies become strange so quickly. You are rarely hurting only the other country. Sometimes you are taxing a supply chain that crosses the border so many times that the words foreign and domestic stop explaining how the product is actually made. No industry shows that better than automobiles. Picture a vehicle assembled in Ontario. The engine may contain American components. The electronics may come from multiple countries. A transmission may cross the border during manufacturing. Steel can come from one place, aluminum from another, software from another. Some parts can cross the US-Canada border more than once before the finished vehicle reaches a dealership. Now impose a tariff on the final Canadian-built vehicle. What exactly are you taxing? A foreign car? An American supply chain? Canadian labor? American components? All of the above? That question is not philosophical. It is one of the real disputes inside the current negotiations. Canada wants the tariff calculation to recognize American-made content inside Canadian vehicles. If the value of US-produced parts is deducted before the tariff is applied, the effective rate on some vehicles could fall well below the headline number. Washington, meanwhile, wants rules that encourage more production inside the United States. That technical argument can decide whether a plant remains competitive. A few percentage points on a spreadsheet can become thousands of jobs in the real world. That is why Canada and Japan are not perfect mirror images. Japan's relationship with the American market is deep. Canada's relationship with the American economy is physically entangled. An entanglement creates a peculiar form of power. It also creates vulnerability. This point matters because it would be easy to turn the story into a cartoon where Canada holds all the resources and Washington has no choice. That would be false. Canada needs the United States badly. A prolonged trade war can damage Canada faster in many sectors precisely because such a large share of Canadian exports traditionally flows south. The United States can redirect investment. Companies can move production. American tariffs have already influenced decisions in the auto industry. Canadian plants do not operate in a protected bubble. If the economics become unattractive for long enough, factories can lose future models, investment can move, jobs can disappear, so Canada's leverage is not dominance. It is mutual pain. That sounds less dramatic, but it is more powerful. Because in a negotiation, you do not need to be stronger than the other side in every category. You need to make the other side calculate the cost of pushing harder. That is exactly where resources begin to matter. Mark Carney has repeatedly emphasized that Canada possesses things the United States wants and needs: energy, minerals, metals, fertilizer, electricity, industrial inputs. The important part is not the speech. The important part is the system behind it. Washington can look at a map and see where Midwest refineries get heavy crude. It can see where farmers get potash. It can see where nuclear utilities source uranium. It can see how much aluminum comes from Canadian smelters. It can see how auto supply chains move across Ontario and Michigan. No threat is required. The dependency is visible before the meeting begins. That is why saying Canada offered nothing is not quite right. Canada did not offer nothing. Canada offered continued access to a relationship America already values. And Canada is making concessions too. Provincial restrictions on American alcohol have become one of Washington's irritants. Several provinces pulled U.S. liquor from shelves as retaliation for earlier tariffs. Ottawa has urged provinces to be prepared to reverse those restrictions if a broader agreement is reached. That may sound minor besides steel, automobiles, and energy. Politically, it is not. Those alcohol restrictions became symbolic for Canadians who wanted to push back against American pressure. Reversing them can look like retreat at home even if negotiators consider the concession economically manageable. Dairy is another sensitive area. Canada's supply management system protects domestic dairy producers through production controls and tariff rate quotas. American presidents have complained about it for years. Trump has been especially vocal. Yet dismantling supply management would be politically explosive inside Canada. So Ottawa is trying to preserve as much of that system as possible, while finding enough movement elsewhere to get a deal. This is negotiation, not surrender. And it is not free. Now look again at Japan. Japan also has cards America values. Japanese companies employ large numbers of Americans. Japanese factories are embedded in U.S. communities. Tokyo is a crucial strategic ally in Asia. Japan holds enormous amounts of U.S. financial assets. Its technology companies matter to semiconductor, robotics, automotive, and advanced manufacturing supply chains. Japan is not weak, but the kind of leverage it used in this negotiation was different. Japan could promise capital. That is powerful because Washington wants factories, infrastructure, and investment. But capital has a quality physical resources do not. It is mobile. Money can be redirected. Loans can be structured. Investments can be delayed. Another investor can sometimes step in. A barrel of the right crude sitting at the end of an existing pipeline is different. A potash deposit created by geology is different. A hydropowered aluminum smelter already integrated into a continental supply chain is different. A mature uranium supply relationship is different. The point is not that one is always more valuable than the other. The point is replacement cost. That may be the single most important phrase in this entire story. Replacement cost. What does it cost the other side to live without what you provide? If the answer is not much, your leverage is limited. If the answer is, we can replace it, but it will take time and money, your leverage improves. If the answer is, we need to redesign infrastructure, find new suppliers, renegotiate contracts, and potentially raise costs for our own voters, then you have something much more serious. And that is why the $550 billion comparison is so revealing. Japan offered Washington something America wants more of. Canada supplies Washington with things parts of America already rely on. One is an incentive. The other is embedded dependency. Now consider the tariff outcomes being discussed. Japan secured a 15% automobile tariff. Canada may also end up around 15% on the top-line auto rate if the current deal is completed. At first glance, that makes the outcomes look similar, but the path is different. Japan's result came alongside a huge strategic investment framework. Canada's potential result comes from months of confrontation, retaliation, supply chain pressure, and negotiations over the details of a deeply integrated continental economy. Steel makes the contrast sharper. Japan's core steel and aluminum tariffs remained at 50% under the separate metal regime. Canada is currently discussing a potential cut to 25%. But even here, the headline can mislead. The proposed Canadian steel relief appears likely to come with quotas. Reports indicate that a certain annual volume could receive the lower tariff while shipments above that level would still face 50%. That is not Canada walking away untouched. It is a compromise. Washington gets protection and the ceiling. Canada gets some relief and predictability. The structure itself tells you what both sides are trying to do. Neither wants the integrated system to break. Both want to change who captures more of the value inside it. And there is another layer that may matter more than any single tariff. Canada is trying to make sure it never has to negotiate from exactly this position again. For decades, the logic of Canadian trade was obvious. The world's largest consumer market was directly next door. The border was stable. Trade agreements reduced friction. Pipelines ran south. Factories were built around continental production. Why spend more to reach distant customers when the richest market on earth is a truck ride away? That logic created prosperity. It also created concentration. And concentration becomes dangerous when the political assumptions supporting it change. Canada is now trying to diversify. The government has set a goal of doubling non-US exports over the next decade, which it says could create roughly $300 billion in additional trade. It has established a strategic exports office. It has pursued new trade agreements. It is placing more emphasis on Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And the energy sector has already begun moving in that direction. The Trans Mountain expansion dramatically increased Canada's ability to move crude to the Pacific coast. That gives Canadian producers more access to buyers in Asia and on the US West Coast. In 2025, US imports of Canadian crude actually declined modestly in part because more Canadian oil could move west through the expanded system. That does not mean Canada is leaving the American market. The economics still strongly favor huge volumes moving south. But every new route changes the negotiation slightly. A country with one customer has very little leverage. A country with two has more. A country with 10 has options. And options are what Canada is trying to build. This is the part of the story that extends beyond Trump-Carney Japan or any single tariff deadline. For 30 years, globalization rewarded efficiency. Companies asked where a product could be made most cheaply. Where could it be shipped fastest? Where could capital earn the best return? Supply chains stretched across borders because the assumption underneath them was that trade would remain open enough for the system to function. That assumption is weaker now. Governments are asking different questions. Where does our uranium come from? Who controls our fertilizer? Which country refines our critical minerals? Can our steel industry survive a crisis? Where are our semiconductors made? How many suppliers can we lose before a factory stops? This changes the meaning of economic power. A country can have a smaller GDP and still control a critical input. A country can have less capital and still sit on the root another economy needs. A country can be economically dependent while still possessing a few things that are unusually difficult to replace. That does not overturn the hierarchy of global power. The United States remains vastly larger than Canada. It has more capital, more technology, more military power, a larger consumer market, and extraordinary influence over global finance. But trade negotiations do not happen in the abstract. They happen product by product, industry by industry, pressure point by pressure point. And in those smaller arenas, the balance can look very different. A fertilizer negotiation does not care who has the larger stock market. A refinery does not care who won the last election. A nuclear reactor does not care which country has the stronger currency. Physical systems care about inputs. That is where Canada has found room to negotiate. And it is where Japan's experience becomes more interesting rather than less. Japan did not fail. It made a rational deal from the position it had. It used financial power to protect a strategically important export industry. It secured a lower automobile tariff. It deepened investment ties with the United States. Those are real gains. But the fact that hundreds of billions of dollars did not eliminate every American tariff is a reminder that capital does not purchase unlimited influence. Canada, meanwhile, has not won anything final yet. The current deal can still change. The details can still disappoint Canadian industries. A 15% auto tariff can still hurt manufacturers. A 25% steel tariff is still a tariff. Quotas can constrain exports. Concessions on alcohol, dairy content rules, and other areas can create political backlash. And the 50% tariff threat hanging over roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods has only been paused while negotiators work. That uncertainty is essential to the story, because the lesson is not written on a final scorecard yet. It is visible in the behavior of the negotiators. Washington is still negotiating. Ottawa is still at the table. Neither side has walked away. Neither side can impose unlimited pain without considering what happens next. And that brings us back to the opening question. If one country puts $550 billion on the table and another does not, which one has more leverage? There is no universal answer. Because leverage is not the size of the offer. Leverage is the size of the problem you create if the other side says no. Japan could make America more attractive as a place to invest. Canada can make parts of the American economy more expensive to operate if the relationship becomes badly disrupted. Japan's capital can build future factories. Canada's crude is already entering existing refineries. Japan's investment can finance strategic industries. Canadian potash is already going on to American farmland. Japan can help America strengthen tomorrow's supply chains. Canada is already inside today's. That is the difference. And it may explain why two countries facing the same president, the same tariff strategy, and the same American market ended up negotiating from completely different positions. The old assumption was that money equals power. The new reality is more complicated. Money is power. Markets are power. Technology is power. Military alliances are power. And control over something another country cannot replace quickly is power too. In an era of tariffs, industrial policy, and supply chain nationalism, that last form of power is becoming much easier to see. Oil, uranium, potash, aluminum, critical minerals, semiconductors, shipping routes, electricity grids. These are no longer background details in an economics textbook. They are bargaining chips. And the countries that understand exactly where they sit inside someone else's supply chain have an advantage. Not because they can dictate terms, but because they know where the pressure travels when someone else tries to dictate terms to them. Japan walked into Washington with an extraordinary amount of capital and secured something valuable. Canada walked into the same era with a different hand entirely. A hand built by geology, geography, and decades of integration. We still do not know the final terms of the Canada-US agreement. Maybe Ottawa gets most of the reductions now being discussed. Maybe Washington holds firm on key details. Maybe the final compromise disappoints both sides. That is usually what real trade deals do. But whatever happens, the larger lesson is already visible. The strongest card in a negotiation is not always what you can promise to give. Sometimes it is what the other side has quietly built its own economy around receiving. And once you understand that, $550 billion no longer looks small. It just stops looking like the only number that matters.